Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Sunday, August 10th, day 674 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our legal and settlements reporter, Jeremy Sharon. Hi, Jeremy. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Hey, Amanda. Good to be with you.
Good to see you. We are going to start the program with an update on the war plan adopted by the government on Thursday night to occupy Gaza City. We'll turn the discussion to the legality of an eventual potential occupation of the entire Gaza Strip. We're going to learn about the growing movement to resettle Gush Katif, 25 years after the disengagement and pullout from the Israeli enclave in the Gaza Strip. All of this and more when we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our legal and settlements reporter, Jeremy Sharon. Following a lengthy meeting on Thursday night, Israel's security cabinet approved Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's plan for the IDF to take over Gaza City. Israel will provide humanitarian aid to the Palestinian civilian population outside of combat zones, and the PMO says a majority of cabinet members approved 5 principles. Number 1, the disarmament of Hamas. 2, the return of all hostages. 3, the demilitarization of Gaza. 4, Israeli security control over the Strip. And 5, the existence of an alternative civilian government that is not Hamas or the Palestinian Authority. On Friday, IDF Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir vowed to carry out the plan in the best possible way. And Arab mediators are also said to be working on a deal to release all 50 remaining hostages from Gaza in one fell swoop in exchange for an end to the war and full Israeli withdrawal from the Strip. But Jeremy, in the past week, there was a lot of talk about conquering and occupying the entire Gaza Strip. And you have been looking into the legalities of such a move. So what have you found?
So, occupying territory in a war is something relatively common. It's called technically a belligerent occupation, and it's when one country takes control of another country's territory, or in this case, another entity's territory, and that comes with various obligations on the occupying power. But in terms of the legality of taking over territory, that's not something which is necessarily illegal by any stretch of the imagination. It's something, as I said, which happens frequently. One thing where there are legal questions is what you do with the territory under your control. Meaning, if you take advantage of your control of your belligerent occupation of that territory for your own benefit, then you might start coming up against various international laws which you might violate. So, for instance, you can't annex territory by force of arms. That is something which international law prohibits. In most circumstances, I should say. Another issue is the deportation or forcible transfer of civilian population. Under most circumstances, that is also illegal unless it's being done for the benefit of the civilian population and with the intention of returning them. So, obviously, there's been a dialogue in Israel, for instance, regarding removing the Palestinian civilian population from Gaza. The far right parties and ministers such as Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich talk about encouraging voluntary immigration. But what method the so-called voluntary part of that immigration takes, could also be very very problematic. So those are some of the legal issues you can come across during a belligerent occupation. There's also another option. In March this year, the Supreme Court issued a ruling about humanitarian access to Gaza. And in that ruling, it also addressed the issue of whether Israel is in occupation of Gaza. And the Supreme Court came to the conclusion that Israel was not in occupation of Gaza because it didn't have effective control, which is a combination of having boots on the ground and being able to govern the territory, and the previous government not being able to govern the territory. So at that stage, the court, which was ruling on the situation up to March, said Israel was not in occupation. Now, if Israel would like to move the civilian population out of Gaza City, which is the current plan, right? There's about 1 million people living in Gaza City. So if Israel wants to move the 1 million people out of Gaza, then in theory, the Hamas authorities, which continue to basically govern the overwhelming majority, if not all, of Gaza's citizens, would continue to govern those people. And Israel might be able to find some legal wiggle room to say that it's not occupying them, right? But then you have to be careful of another situation in terms of the international law, which is if you carry out a military operation without an appropriate humanitarian response for the people that you're evacuating, then that can also violate the laws of war if you're knowingly creating a humanitarian, kind of a crisis or catastrophe because you haven't found the correct way to provide for those people you're moving on. So that would be a second set of problems which Israel would have if it seeks in some way to evacuate the people out of Gaza. And then there's full occupation in that whether Israel wants to take control only of Gaza City or all of the Gaza Strip, meaning all of the civilian population. Then you're really coming up into that issue of a belligerent occupation. And in a belligerent occupation, the occupant becomes legally responsible for the welfare of the civilian population. So that's right up to now. Israel says it's not an occupation of Gaza's civilians, so did the Supreme Court. So therefore its legal responsibilities are far less. It has to enable the provision of humanitarian aid to the civilian population for the most part. But it doesn't have to do it from its own resources, for instance. And it can have other people, other organizations do it, like the UN, humanitarian agencies, right? If Israel turns its control of Gaza into a full-blown occupation, then basically it takes full responsibility. And therefore, right, for a long time, Israel's been saying, well, the UN isn't collecting and distributing the aid, and so therefore it's the UN's fault. But under a full occupation, that we wouldn't have that excuse. We wouldn't be able to say that because we, as the occupant, would be legally responsible for the welfare of Palestinian citizens. So if the aid wasn't being distributed, then we would have to do it. If the aid, we would have to provide the aid if no one else was providing it. So you also have to talk about kind of municipal issues, municipal services, health services, education services. All of this begins to become part of the realm of responsibility for the occupying power. Now, there was a few weeks ago, there was a lot of talk about establishing a humanitarian city, which was very controversial in and of itself. Defense Minister Israel Katz, said that this was a plan and that put all of Gaza's, eventually put all Gaza's population in that humanitarian city, which, has its own legal concerns. But, the IDF told the government that to do that plan would cost some 15 billion shekels, right? That's about $4.5 billion. And also that's a huge amount of money. That's a large amount of money on top of Israel's, current budget, currently in economic difficulties because of the ongoing war and not only the cost of the war, but the economic effects. So, you also have to bear that in mind. Why is the bill for the humanitarian city so large? Because the responsibilities are so much greater in terms of all the aspects of maintaining and preserving the welfare of that civilian population, which you have to commit to if you're going to occupy 1 million people, 2 million people, or however many it is. So that's some of the aspects of the legal aspects of what it would entail to occupy in the legal sense Gaza and its civilian population.
Okay, Jeremy, this is all extremely essential information, and I've just been jotting down a few notes, comments, questions while you've been talking. And number one, as far as we understand, the occupation of Gaza City will take about 2 months. So one could hope that part of this 2-month rollout is indeed the humanitarian zone for the residents, the 1 million out of the some 2 million plus residents of the entire Gaza Strip. And so that leads to my question, actually. Right now, the IDF is saying that it occupies something like 75% of the Strip, and the last 25% is basically the populated areas, right? And so if the IDF were to only, quote unquote, occupy Gaza City, which is about 1 million, we'll say half the population of the Gaza Strip, does that mean that Israel at that point would be on the line for all of these responsibilities that you're talking about as the occupier?
I think that would be the case as far as those 1 million citizens are concerned, because at the end of the day, if the test of effective control can be applied to Gaza City, then that means that Israel is in control and has responsibility. Again, the test is having boots on the ground, IDF soldiers being present in Gaza City, being able to govern the territory, right? And that the previous government can no longer govern the territory. So if all those factors are in place on the ground, and I think critically that Hamas would not be able to govern Gaza City anymore. Well, then automatically Israel would have the ability to govern Gaza, and therefore would be responsible for Gaza City's 1 million people. I think these are complicated legal questions, but I think that would be the way you have to look at it, because otherwise, who could be said to be responsible for those for that civilian population?
Okay, one final question. I don't know if you're equipped to answer, but we do have a model already, and that is Rafah, of course, because the city of Rafah is basically empty of its residents. And if I'm not mistaken, there were something like 700,000 residents there. Please don't quote me on that. And so these 700,000, we'll say that there were moved to the Mawasi tent city area and other parts of the strip, or moved themselves voluntarily. So what would Israel's responsibility be here?
Well, so I think, again, if there is, as I understand it, very few, if any, civilians in Rafah at the moment, then Israel doesn't really have any responsibility there, or doesn't have responsibility for the citizens that have moved to the Mawasi area. As I understand it, Hamas generally, within the populated areas of Gaza, is still, it has police forces, or some kind of paramilitary militias policing the population, and in some ways or other it takes control of aid to varying degrees. I think Hamas is still, can be said to be, governing the overwhelming majority of the civilian population, because the IDF simply isn't there, and that's where the writ of Hamas's rule is. So regarding Rafah, I think as of the rest of the 75% of Gaza where the IDF is controlling, according to the Supreme Court, at least from the March ruling, Israel does not have those legal responsibilities of occupation there.
Let's go to a short break. And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with our legal and settlements reporter, Jeremy Sharon. Now, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition is reliant on Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich and National Security Minister Ben Gvir, who both seek to occupy the Gaza Strip permanently in order to push Palestinians out of the enclave and re-establish Jewish settlements in their place. And on Wednesday, last week, we saw hundreds of ultranationalist activists who are also hoping to establish new Israeli settlements in the Gaza Strip. They set out in the evening hours from a spot close to the Gaza border city of Sderot and began walking westward toward a lookout point less than a kilometer away from the Strip, with loudspeakers blaring the whole time. The way to defeat Hamas is to take back our land. We're seeing reports all over Israeli media, and Channel 12 had a report saying that 300 families are ready to resettle the Strip in a moment's notice. So, Jeremy, talk to us about this, it seems to me, growing movement to resettle the Gaza Strip.
Okay, so just briefly to step back, we'll talk about the 2005 disengagement, when there was some 8,500 people in the various settlements in Gaza. I think 15 or 16 settlements in Gaza. It was called the Gush Katif block. And they were, mostly, but not exclusively, from the religious Zionist community. And the disengagement, the evacuation or removal of those settlers and those settlements from Gush Katif, from the Gaza Strip, was a real monumental and disastrous event for the national religious movement, especially the more ideologically, religiously inclined parts of it, which really saw every step of the War of Independence, the Six-Day War, redemption of the land of Israel, moving forward to kind of a messianic future of final redemption, and conceding territory, part of what is considered the biblical land of Israel. That was seen as a real blow and a real defeat. So the depth of feeling here 20 years later remains intense. And I think, we're talking mostly, this movement about talking about returning to settle Gaza is almost exclusively from the religious Zionist community, and especially kind of the hardcore right-wing segment of that community. You talk about it's growing. I think there is a hardcore who are interested. The Nachala settlement movement, which is one of the leading organizations driving this forward, in terms of publicly advocating for it, they talked about 300 families ready to go and settle, and I think they're talking about northern Gaza. When I was at a conference, or a conference slash rally last October on the Gaza border, also by Nachala, they talked then about 700 families, and I think we may even now be up to 1,000 families. And what are we talking about? They say that they have organized these hundreds of families into what I call cadres of groups of people who are going to go and the idea is that they go and settle in a particular part of the Gaza Strip, and so 200 families settle in this place and it will be called that settlement, and in the north, and then 200 families settle in this place in the center and it'll be called such and such. So that's the kind of plan they have, and obviously they've been talking about this ever since Israel began, its ground invasion of Gaza after the events of October 7th, 2023, because obviously it has been seen as the opportunity to rectify that terrible wrong which was done to the settlement movement back in 2005. And during the course of this government, we've also had legislation to kind of symbolically erase that terrible blow which they suffered. So that legislation pertained to 3 settlements in the northern West Bank, which were evacuated at the same time as Gaza. And when that legislation passed in the Knesset, I think it was led by Yuli Edelstein from the Likud, and they talked about eradicating that historic failing of the Israeli government at the time of prohibiting Jews from being in any part of the biblical land of Israel. So as I said, this is something which is very extremely heartfelt by a segment of the population. I don't know how realistic it is, because even Netanyahu said just a couple of days ago that talking about the plans to conquer and occupy the Gaza Strip, I think he told Fox News that Israel does not want to keep control of it, and that would seem to run in the face of what Smotrich and Ben Gvir want. And we saw even last night Smotrich saying that he's not happy with the way that Netanyahu is running the war, and thinks that Netanyahu can no longer win the war. And as you mentioned, a lot of the rhetoric amongst this camp is that the only way to win is to take land away from the Palestinians, to resettle as a form of security. And in fact, at that October rally, which I mentioned, I spoke to several people there, including a guy called Chaim Walzer, who used to live in Gush Katif, and he said that his opinion was that the only thing, this I'm kind of quoting here, he says the only thing the Palestinians care about is land, and if we settle there and take that away from them, that's the only way that they will know we have won. So this is the kind of mindset of the Gaza return movement, and they very much mean it. When Nachala says they've got 300 families ready to go at a moment's notice, that's absolutely true. That they have real hardcore, diehard people who will absolutely go and settle if given the opportunity.
Right. And they have such, in my mind, they have such strong support within the halls of the Knesset. Just another quote from Smotrich from last week. It's closer than ever, meaning the resettlement is closer than ever. It's a realistic work plan. We didn't sacrifice all this to transfer Gaza from one Arab to another Arab. Gaza is an inseparable part of the land of Israel. Okay, and they talked about, of course, not just going back to Gush Katif, but to settle even more than Gush Katif, many larger settlements. And at that same march that we were talking about earlier, 6 cabinet ministers and 16 coalition MKs requested that Defense Minister Israel Katz approve a scouting mission for the activists inside Gaza, meaning to figure out where they want to resettle. And that's including Communications Minister Shlomo Karhi. He's from Likud, from the ruling party, and MK Limor Son Har Melech, who's, of course, from the much more radical party, Otzma Yehudit. They were at the march themselves. You mentioned Yuli Edelstein. Of course, he was talking about the West Bank settlements. There are 3, I believe, 3 or 4, if I'm not mistaken. 4, I think, actually, who were pulled out alongside Gush Katif in 2005. That's much more consensus at this point, the West Bank, right? But we're talking about Gush Katif in the Gaza Strip getting support from numerous ministers, MKs within the ruling party itself. I mean, to me, it smells like something is really about to happen.
So to one extent, I hear what you're saying, because obviously there does seem to be growing political support for it, especially within the Likud party. I don't know how much of it is kind of political jockeying and a kind of an attempt to curry favor amongst a growingly radical political voting base. Some of the MKs and so on, they can say lots of things, but they don't really have any impact or control over policy. But I think as you say, when you have such senior ministers and politicians speaking in that manner, obviously it continues to drive legitimacy and increase the public awareness of something that might be an option. So that when Netanyahu says, okay, well, it's not realistic or it's not going to happen, at the same time, there's this kind of force of momentum building up behind him, which can then kind of, jam him further into a corner. And, I hear what you're saying, I hear your concerns. And I think in the US, when the US administration also doesn't seem to be to know exactly what it wants to happen in Gaza, I think then things can develop and perhaps gain their own momentum. But I would still say that despite all of that, I would not think it likely that Israel does build settlements again in Gaza at the moment.
I think it's unlikely that Israel will build settlements. I think it's increasingly likely that settlers will build settlements just in the same way that they do on hilltops, et cetera, et cetera. But this is a much longer conversation, and we're going to end our episode here. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining me today.
Good to be with you, Amanda.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.